Welcome to episode 3 of Skeleton Songs.
The episode where Lottie won't let me sit next to the cat.
Now this is a vile calumny because there is a good
It's
reason.
literally true.
It is true, but it's also very misleading because Alexis has ADHD, which means he apparently can do what he likes and justify all of it. And you may have heard in our last episode that there was quite a big clang several times in the background. That it's my job to edit out badly, which I can't do because I don't understand editing software. So now I have physically interposed myself between man and cat.
He's so fluffy.
Thus justifying all the misogynist claims of literature forever. But we are talking this week about...
Doppelgängers.
Would you like to define doppelgangers?
Doublegoers. Well, we when we started looking into this, we found there's two kinds, really, of double. And doppelgangers and fetchers and car and foregoers that we're all talking about. But there's duplicates of people that appear, and there's elements of people that manifest as duplicates. And of course, I think one of the reasons the legends about this get so intricate is that it's not like anybody sat down and said, I'm going to create a legend that exemplifies the external articulation of the baser aspect of the self, and then
Science.
everyone else hewed to that theme. So if somebody says there's this legend about if you go to a graveyard at dawn, then you see yourself, it means you've got to die. But if you go to a graveyard at dusk and you see yourself, it means you're going to live a long, happy life. And then somebody else.
I mean,
2
I actually
centuries
love
later,
that idea, but sure.
that's actually a thing.
Is it?
Yes. So
Wait, sorry. There's like a horoscope of seeing yourself.
So well, this is the point: is that it's all myth, it's all legend, it's all folklore, all of which, are, of course, totally different things. And somebody picks a compelling idea from a piece of folklore 2 centuries before, writes into a short story, and it means something different. But the doppelganger is the doublegoer, literally, obviously, the identical version of the person who is seen by that person or by somebody else. And often you'll see them on a lonely road, you'll pass somebody and they won't speak to you, and you speak to them, and you'll go home and say, I saw
that
you.
Was odd.
That was odd. And obviously sometimes maybe it's just that the doppelganger is somebody who really, oh shit, it's him. I'm just going to look at the ground and pretend I don't know him. But yeah, if you see, this is something that comes up again and again, is if you see somebody, and this is the doppelganger myth in Germany and points east, it's the fetchers in England, Ireland, Scotland. And if you see a fetch, one version of a person at morning, and if you see, that means they're going to die. If you see a fetch at evening, that's good news. It means they're going to live a long, wonderful life.
You see, that's the difference between you and me. I discovered also that they were known as fetches, which I hadn't known before researching for this podcast. And my immediate response was, we're making fetch happen. We are finally, this is the mean girl dream. But you were like, I'm actually going to read about the myths and what actually happened. But go
Well, you have
on.
your episode title now. So fetchers, doppelgangers, car. So that's again, it's one of the things that comes up and starts.
Which,
Susie
for an audio program, we should spell as K-A.
K-A. This is one of the things that comes up as soon as you start looking at duplicates of people. Okay, I'm going to say this with an asterisk. The ancient Egyptians had asterisk, and we'll come back to that asterisk.
We're going to be doing audio punctuation from now on, so sit back and enjoy.
Audio hyperlinks. A complex conception of the soul, and one of the elements of the soul was the car, Ka. Now, that asterisk is as follows. Ancient Egypt was a civilization that stretched from something like 2500 BC to 50 BC, when it shades into the Ptolemies. So, talking about ancient Egyptian culture is like talking about European culture from before classical Greece all the way through to 21st century Europe. Because there was less technological advancement in Egypt, because it was in this very circumscribed domain along the Nile, where it's really important you have your annual floods and you've got an autocratic top-down system of government. It changed a lot less than European culture changed in the last 2,500 years. And it is, as I understand, as a very amateur historian, certainly not an Egyptologist, still meaningful to talk about ancient Egyptian culture. But, for example, when you talk about Egyptian beliefs of the soul, I went digging, and first of all, I found a lot of Egyptian texts about the soul of wonderfully evocative names, like the Book of Traversing Eternity.
Wow.
Or the Spell of the 12 Caves.
Oh, they are good.
Or the Book of the Sky. But the coffin texts, which is the sort of end of the, I can't remember if it's Old Kingdom or Middle Kingdom, end of Old Kingdom. But anyway, it's not important. So the coffin texts are, it's not even one text, it's a bunch of stuff that was written like on the walls of pyramids and sarcophagi that included spells and descriptions of the afterlife and was assembled into a sort of more or less coherent body. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is the one that everyone's heard of, was really one text, but it was one text that was updated over the whole of the New Kingdom period. So that is about 1,000 years. So, and it didn't have the same kind of top-down idea of dogma that the Bible has. So this is one body of opinion over 1,000 years, during which gods have risen and fell, and some gods get promoted and some gods get demoted, and occasionally you get an enthusiast who tries to impose monotheism Akhenaten, on the whole thing and so on. But the point is, the car is physically, in appearance, it's physically identical to the person, and one of the distinctive features of some Egyptian ideas about the afterlife is that life begins when you die. So you get put in the tomb, and it's sort of important to keep looking after you. You need funerary offerings because the car's got to eat something. So you go and leave beer in the tomb.
Wait, so the car is a version of you that is birthed to life when your original body dies?
So,
because that's not what I would normally call a doppelganger.
Well, this is the thing: is depending on which text you read, or in my case, which sort of tertiary versions of secondary accounts. The text
this is
you
a
read.
very, very in-depth research program.
The car is something that you will see walking about while the person's still alive, because their personality is in some way separated from their body
because of the certainty of their impending death.
Yes, so
Gotcha.
You've got this connection still with the idea of death, and things
which would then
come.
Explain the kind of thing about, if you see it at a certain time, that it means something, because the car wouldn't exist unless some significant life event were about to occur to the individual.
Yes,
got it.
Yeah, and you kind of, I think often when you talk about doppelgangers or about parts of the soul that have appeared separately, it's something that's come unmoored because something important. And this is one of the things that comes up in the In-Soul Codex a lot, is that you get elements of the soul as organs of being that allow people to continue to exist. Like, it takes work to continue to exist, in the same way that your heart keeps your blood pumping around your body, otherwise you drop dead. If you don't have the relevant bits of your soul all operating together, then you'll just pop out of existence. But that's obviously not an Egyptian thing. That's much later. That's like 15th century in the village of In-Soul. And the Egyptian thing is bits of your soul start separating, and again your heart or your physical body are maybe parts of your air quotes soul, because of course there's no one single translation for the word soul in any language. There'll be different things all the time.
I think that idea of unmooring is really interesting, because I had no idea that this sort of idea of the doppelganger or the other self would go back as far as ancient Egypt. Though of course, as soon as you say it, like, they were well into their spirituality and had a whole kind of plan for it all, so it would make sense. But I know it primarily through Gothic literature, and the doppelganger is a famous trope of literature at that time, and that often revolves around ideas of sort of divided selves, or madness, or some kind of cause of extreme anxiety or obsession. And one of the things that the late 19th century literature really loves to play with is the idea of, is it madness or is it reality? So there is this constant sense of the individual becoming unmoored from reality, and is it that they're sort of having this third eye that's opening to this other spectral realm where Ka and doppelgangers actually exist, or is it that they are having some sort of breakdown? And like most Gothic literature, it usually ends with a violent ending that doesn't go well for the protagonist, and leaves questions unanswered. So one of the classic endings of a kind of doppelganger trope would be that ultimately the protagonist gets so obsessed or upset or angry that they kill the look-alike, and that often ends up killing them as well. Stab you in the heart, and then it turns out that my heart is bleeding too. And some of the highest profile doppelganger examples of literature of that time is, of course, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which doesn't go great for him, or Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde's very famous novel, which again has a sense of ultimately destroying this other self and that being your destruction too.
I hadn't thought about that, and that ties into, I won't go into it quite yet, but the Gerald Durrell thing that I was going to talk about later. And it does tie into one of the things that started coming clear when I looked into this, which is there's two literary or mythological functions that doppelgangers, duplicates, fetchers tend to serve. One is that they're externalizations of personality, as we said before, and that really works if you're doing something literary, and it's a really natural thing to do if you're thinking about yourself. You externalize yourself. But the other thing is identity horror. And
I love identity horror.
It's
I don't have any existential issues.
So if you're thinking about which part of you is really you,
oh God,
is it your body? Of course not. There's something in you, isn't it? Where does it exist? It exists. It's obviously the actual you is located at a point 2 inches behind
your eyes. Yeah,
where your lines of sight happen to go inside.
Where
is it the same person all the
exists.
time? But as soon as it starts bringing out, or as soon as you start seeing somebody else be mistaken for you, so this.
Have you ever been mistaken for someone else?
I don't think so.
I think I was once accused of looking like Frank Zappa, which I found quite
That's
upsetting.
really mean.
It was quite. I was a fat kid.
But I was going to say there's a rich subgenre of stuff like Dostoyevsky's The Double, which I haven't read. Ayardi's
Tolstoy's better
film of The Double, which I have seen, which is fucking great. And
to be fair, The Idiot Has My Heart Forever, another Dostoyevsky classic.
Or, to keep lowering the tone, you keep being literary, Silent Hill 2.
Wait until I get later on.
It's all about the identity horror again. But this as soon as you start not being clear which is actually you or which other people think is you, because identity is about what other people think you are as well as what you think you are. So if everybody's saying that person over there is the real you, we'll just put you behind this window and you can beat on it in horror as the other you puts an arm around your spouse and kids.
Well, I have a very specific example. That does sound horrific. And we do live in an age of curated social media profiles where a lot of people's interaction with us all is via this heavily curated version of ourselves that we put up online. And that leads to what we often call impostor syndrome, which is, of course, actually the doppelganger syndrome and actually quite a well-documented medical issue of actually thinking your identity is someone else's. It's part of psychosis and delusion. But we have a little inkling of that every day because we all, none of us put up photos on Instagram of us waking up in the morning or falling down the stairs or forgetting to put the right shoes on.
There's that C word thing you like, isn't there?
The C word?
The syndrome something.
Do you mean Capgras?
I possibly do. I didn't know it was Capgras. Okay.
It is, because a moron that I am, I've been pronouncing it Capgras syndrome, and it turns out it's by a French guy. So it's definitely Capgras, and therefore anyone who heard me talk about it obviously knew that I was talking nonsense. But yes, this is a really rare, badly understood syndrome where essentially you believe that people you know are being replaced by identical copies of themselves. So it's not them, but it is them. And of course, this leads this poor patient to having horrific anxiety, and there's a sense of kind of who is doing that and why, and there's a malignancy around the people they believe to have been replaced. And sometimes it revolves around one particular individual. So there's lots of documented cases of spouses waking up one morning and thinking the person next to them who've been married to for years is not the person they know, so they'll refuse to share beds with them and they'll refuse to stay in the same house, and it's obviously very frightening. And there are also documented cases of people thinking everyone in their close circle of friends is actually being slowly replaced, leading to general senses of anxiety and terror. Interestingly, there's a temporal version, which I hadn't heard about, where time is warp or substituted, and you think that something weird is timey-wimey going on. And there is a locational version as well, which is called reduplicative paramnesia, which I just wanted to say, where you think that certain locations either exist at the same time in another location or have been replaced or have been moved. So that's a whole nother kettle of fish.
And that's really interesting, but it's sort of the geographical equivalent of identity horror. if you don't know who you are, you don't know where you are, you don't know when you are, all these seem...
You're just kind of lost in this void.
Yeah.
And what really struck me about, Capgras syndrome is really interesting anyway, because it's just such a horrible idea, and obviously it ties into this idea of the doppelganger, that somebody is being replaced, and how do you deal with that? It's not about yourself, but it is about, people you really care about and love and know. And I looked into the scientific background of what we think is going on, because like I said, it's very misunderstood. And I found this really interesting thing, which is it's believed it's probably linked to prosopagnosia, which is where patients lose the ability to recognise faces. This has been most popularly documented in Oliver Sacks's The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, in case anybody is interested and hasn't read that. It's brilliant. But people believe that there are two pathways to facial recognition. There's the conscious pathway, which is, I'm looking at you, Alexis, and we've been dating nearly 5 years, so I'm fairly confident it's you and I know who you are. But there is also the unconscious pathway, which is autonomic arousal. Now, that doesn't mean that you are very sexy, that I'm getting aroused. What it means is that my body is physically responding through electrodermal signals to this sense of recognition and knowledge. There's something physical that happens, which is kind of your example of where does the soul start and the body end, right? And what people believe happens with Capgras syndrome is the conscious function is there, so I look at you and I see Alexis, but my body's autonomic arousal is failing, so I get this inherent sense that you are the person I know, but there's something wrong. And a lot of patients have described it as this sense that there's just something off, or it just isn't them, because they're getting these two opposite signals to their brain, which is horrible, but I find fascinating from the idea of the kind of doppelganger motif.
That's really interesting, and that
right?
It reminds me of two things. One is very briefly, because neither is exactly doppelgangery. One is a horrifying short story called The Screwfly Solution.
I think you've told me about it.
I have told you about it, and I don't want to spoil it for our listeners, but it's by James Tiptree Jr., who is the pseudonym of Alice Sheldon, who's a very interesting, complicated SF author last century. And The Screwfly Solution deals with what happens when one biological physiological really process
embarrassing
that's normally associated with good things doesn't get associated with good things. I have read it, it's horrible. And then you have nightmares. Sorry. The other thing is much nicer. It's Ted Chiang, lovely Ted Chiang.
I love Ted Chiang,
who did the most famously, he wrote the story in which the film Arrival was based, but Stories of Your Life and Others, which I think has the Arrival story in that collection, also contains a story called Liking What You See, a documentary, which is it's presented in the form of talking heads doing transcripts in a near future world where there is a voluntary process called kaliagnosia, which is sort of a version of prosopagnosia, where you undergo a very subtle neurological operation that, instead of preventing you from recognising faces, prevents you from judging how attractive a face is. Ooh. So once you've been through kaliagnosia, you can't see whether or not somebody is attractive. So it's sort of analogous in the story to something like being a vegetarian, where you just decide to stop participating in something that you think is bad, even if other people still are, like judging people on their appearance. So that
being Ted Chiang, I assume it has some surprising outcomes.
It does. There are some surprising outcomes, and then there is an interesting, thought-provoking twist. It being Ted Chiang.
Well, we're really selling literature in this podcast.
But everyone should read Ted Chiang.
They should. He's great. And
the other thing I wanted to talk about was the Gerald Durrell thing, which follows on very naturally from what you were saying. So Gerald Durrell. Had you heard of Gerald Durrell before I mentioned him?
No, but you said it about 8 times, and I feel like he's my brother.
So he's. I think he's. I'm 48, and Gerald Durrell was sort of famous in the previous generation, I guess. He was a conservationist and author who was part of a peculiar literary family who founded a zoo for endangered species in Jersey, where it exists to this day. So he was generally sort of another complicated, interesting person, but generally well regarded. And he wrote a lot of fluffy, likeable books that sold well in airports about his adventures going off and collecting animals, and about the bonkers things that happened when he was growing up as a nature-obsessed boy on a Greek island with his mother. But he also wrote this story called, I think it's The Entrance, and it comes at the end of a collection of fluffy, friendly stories about his family and things. And it presents initially as he's gone to stay with a couple who he knows in a farmhouse in Provence, and he talks about like their dogs and their cooking, and they say some sort of witty bohemian 1970s things, which is a very Gerald Joel short story. And then they casually mention that they have this old book that they bought on an auction that some doctor left as a memoir in the 19th century. And somebody says, "Oh, you're a writer,
trope.
Gerald. Why don't you read it before you go to sleep?" And the rest of the story is this absolutely chilling classic Gothic thing. It's obviously written explicitly as Gothic, that I won't spoil in too much detail. And the plot's quite complex, but our protagonist goes to a lonely French chateau where he ends up snowed in the dead of winter, alone in the chateau, with no company but a cat and a dog, and a lot of mirrors.
Oh,
because the old man who used to own the chateau liked his mirrors, and he starts to notice that initially with this really big mirror in an attic, but also these other mirrors all around the house, all bear the same inscription, which is, "I am your servant. Feed and liberate me.
What?
I am you."
What?
And so one night he's sitting in front of the fireplace, looking at the reflection of the room in this big mirror, and the cat snoozing on his lap and the dog snoozing by the fire. And he sees the door in the reflection is open a crack, just like in real life, but there's this sort of thing that's come through the door, and he thinks it's like a big caterpillar. It's sort of humping along the carpet. And he looks closer,
humanoid?
and he realises it's a hand. It's like a yellow hand with blackened nails.
Ugh.
And he sees it in the mirror, and it's moving, and he yields to temptation. He throws like a fragment of his dinner over to the door, and the dog bounds after it, and the hand suddenly comes to life, grabs the dog, and like snatches it, breaks its neck, and drags it behind the door, leaving bloody fingerprints on the door.
Oh my god!
And he thinks, well, this is bonkers. Nothing's happened in the world. It's just in the reflection, and he thinks he just was short on sleep and imagined the whole thing. But the next day when he's going around the house,
He does not find the dog.
no, the dog's there, but the dog doesn't have a reflection anymore.
Ah!
So he still sees this hand in the reflection, but only in the reflection.
So is it a hand that leads to something behind the door?
Yes. Well, this is the thing. So he thinks, I wonder what the thing behind the door is. So just to be clear, if you are ever in
a gothic situation, never wonder what the thing is behind the door. Just think about what you're going to do when you have your Domino's pizza and sit down with your mum. That is the safest train of thought.
So obviously what he does is, in a moment of foolish temptation, you won't approve of this, he scrumples up a ball of paper and he rolls it in front of the door, and the cat chases it, and the hand grabs the cat.
I absolutely disapprove of that.
And draws it behind the door, and after this he's just like, okay, maybe I shouldn't mess anymore.
You think?
But unfortunately, he's fed whatever's behind the door. So the following day in the library,
I remember the quote.
There's the dog and cat. There's also a parrot, and he's in the library talking to the parrot when this thing in the reflection, like, shambles in, and it looks like a sort of corpse in a winding sheet. There's a very grisly description. It grabs the parrot and wrenches the bars of the cage apart, consumes the parrot, all in the reflection. So he's gazing in horror, and the parrot's gazing in horror as well, because the parrot can see what's going on.
Yeah.
And the parrot's gone, he's still there. But then the thing looks through the mirror and sees him.
Oh,
and then it looks at his reflection, and it goes off his reflection. He watches his reflection try and fail to fight this thing off. And so his reflection is devoured as well. And this thing comes right up to the mirror, and it starts beating on it.
Oh my god.
With its fists. And like Durrell says, he's a good writer, and he's just not used to seeing his talent set on other things. like somebody trapped underneath the ice in a pond, slamming on the ice. And he thinks he starts to see cracks in the glass, and so does the thing.
Break the mirror?
And
Maybe
the thing looks at him, looks at the cracks, looks back at his body, and it notices there's a heavy ebony-handled cane lying by the body, because he's still holding this ebony-handled cane in his reflection. So it lurches over and picks up the ebony-handled cane and comes over towards the mirror. And then he picks up a chair in terror and smashes the mirror. And it's gone. He can't see the thing anymore. And then he realises that he's now completely alone in this mansion, which contains at least a dozen other mirrors scattered over the whole of a sprawling chateau. That's about 2/3 of the way through the story, and I won't spoil the rest for you.
I want to read it.
It's very, very good. It's called The Entrance, and
amazing.
It's in a collection called The Picnic and Such Like Pandemonium. Everything else in there is super wholesome, but yeah. I am your servant. Feed me and liberate me. I am you. There's a resolution to the story, which is also sort of troubling and uncertain in its meaning.
Well, mirrors is something that is a trope of the writer that I wanted to briefly talk about, which is my final example of doppelgangers in literature. And it's a much maligned part of literature. I know we talk a lot about like the classical canon and traditional books, and this is a webcomic artist by the name of Emily Carroll. And she is most famous for two collections of her comics. One is Through the Woods, and one of which is When I Arrived at the Castle, and that one is particularly mirror orientated. It's a very sort of Angela Carter-esque feminist vampire thing. But Through the Woods is what shot her to fame. She actually began with her first comic, I think, that went viral, is called His Face All Red. And I love this story. It haunts me more than like most other things that I've ever read. And it uses a lot of very traditional fairy tale motifs. So the premise is there are these two brothers who exist in this, unnamed village, very rural. I think they're all shepherds. And there's the elder brother who's handsome and strong and popular, and he's married to, I think she's just described as like a plump wife with starry eyes, and everyone loves him, and he's very brave, and he has lots of sheep. And his younger brother is not as handsome and not very popular and quite quiet, doesn't have any sheep, and there's a sort of intimation that maybe he kind of envies what his brother has, as you might, being obviously the less good version of a brother pair. And this village begins to be terrorised by something that comes to steal sheep in the night. And, first couple of nights it happens, people think, oh, well, this happens, wolves come out, whatever. And of course the village is, by the way, next to a forest, as you would expect. But I think there's one night where something like 4 sheep are taken at once, and the villagers think, this can't go on. We've got to send somebody into the forest to hunt this monster down and kill it so we can continue with our lovely idyllic rural life. And of course, the brave, noble elder brother says, I'll do it. I think that the younger brother might actually have decided to offer himself initially, because he's finally like, this is my moment to prove that I'm worthy. And then the elder brother says, I'll help you. And the younger brother's like, yay! And everyone's like, oh, you're so brave, elder brother, and I guess younger brother too, whatever. So they go off into the woods together to hunt this creature. Again, I'm not going to ruin the story because it's so good, and it's actually available online. You can read the whole thing in its utter glory. If you just Google... You
should buy the book, though. It's gorgeous.
You should buy the book, and these links will be in the podcast notes, but it's just genius. But something happens in the woods, which means that the younger brother is the only one who comes back to the village. And he tells everybody that this thing has happened, and everyone's very sad. And they all obviously miss this elder brother, but the younger brother feels like, I finally did something good, and everyone's kind of grudgingly respectful of him. And then a couple mornings later, he wakes up and everyone seems really happy. And they're really happy because the elder brother has appeared back in the village, which we know that he should not have. And this sparks this whole very traditional kind of growing horror doppelganger trope of there's this one character, the protagonist, who knows that this cannot be the person that he appears to be, although physically he's exactly the same. And the only difference, and only the protagonist noticed this, is the coat he is wearing is not torn and bloodied. And no one else notices that. He's just back to where he is, and the only thing that he does that's a bit odd, and again nobody notices this, is he's perfectly normal, he talks, he eats, he sleeps, he's happy. He will not look at the younger brother. So eventually the younger brother gets so stressed out about this, as you would, even though there's nothing, actually threatening going on, that he goes back into the woods and he retraces their steps and he goes back to the place where the event occurred, to finally have this last look. And I'm not going to tell you what happens. It's a very short comic that you should read, but the final panel is one of the most haunting things ever, and it doesn't explain it, but it gives you this very complete finale, and just the idea of it's pretty clear that this represents more than just a face-forward tale of somebody coming back who shouldn't be able to come back. It's quite clear that it's psychologically orientated, that there is definitely an element of envy, of guilt, of probably other things going on in the protagonist's mind, or I suppose the antagonist, depending on how you feel about it. And this is a great example of the doppelganger being a reflection of the individual's personal issues, rather than being this sort of separate entity that actually just comes on the scene like, a dog or a cow or a monster. And it's absolutely fascinating, and I never thought that I'd find such an interesting and nuanced portrayal of doppelgangers and gothic tropes in a webcomic. But that's Emily Carroll for you. She's utterly brilliant.
It occurs to me that one of the... We started out saying what are doppelgangers, and the myth is very easily described. It's, if you sometimes you see somebody who looks like you but isn't you, and it's not clear what it is, and sometimes it means you're going to die. And there's that's nothing, but it's the jumping off point that's interesting. And of course, doppelgangers went into a bunch of other fantasy contexts, most notably a D&D, as humanoid creatures that can take the shape of other creatures.
Those are shapeshifters. They're different.
Well, this is the thing. Doppelgangers in D&D are perfectly good. In fact, a good basis for a story, because things that shapeshift and take people's place are interesting. But at the same time, it's the classic RPG problem of taking something non-specific and strange that is deliberately not finally explained, and having to render it in a coherent, specific way where you can ask questions about the life cycle of the beings, because it's difficult to maintain that deliberate imprecision and ambiguity when you've got a bunch of players sitting around a table who say things like, I poke it with a stick, does it turn back into its original form? Is the blood the same? It's just harder to do that in that context. That's one of the things that that you can do with some kinds of game, but you can't do with others.
Well, I think that wraps it up for our brief run through of doppelgangers and car, and generally spooky things that look like other things that they shouldn't, and mirrors. But if we've missed anything out, let us know. If you know of any doppelganger tropes that you think are unusual or unique, ping us.
If it even is us at all.
That's true. You'll never know. Our voices could just be the voices of people who've come, eaten our brains, and taken over our mortal form. Have a spooky day!